So just a real quick explanation of the title of the sermon. Mind the Gap is a little sign that you'll see in the tube in London, where I guess there's a gap between the platform and the subway. So they have all these mind the gap. So that's where it came from, but it's really, if you have a pencil, you could write in here, between the and the gap, you could write theological. Because that's what we're going to be talking about, theological gaps. And joy of joy, theology. And looky here, our monthly theme is the unknown. Seems kind of appropriate to pair these two together, the unknown and theology. And I'm not claiming agnosticism, not formally or officially or presently. But, what do we know about theology? It's the study of God or gods or words about God or gods. And many of us, in fact, make our claims about God in reaction to the definitions of that idea that are put forth by others who have given no thorough critical thought to what they believe. This is what I have discovered in talking to many people over the years. So it's a ludicrous strategy to do theology this way, based on somebody else's ill-investigated fairy tale. I mean, in no other aspect of our life would we behave in this way. It's as if we would watch an utter imbecile try to drive a car and then say, that car won't drive. That's not good theology. Theology, by the way, which does not, despite linguistic evidence to the contrary, have to be words about God, strictly speaking, or words about theos. Theology is an endeavor that calls to the richest part of our humanity, our imagination, our poetry, our sense of self, and our understanding of reality and meaning. So because I see it in this way, there's another word that I sometimes like to use instead of theology. Instead of words about God, theology, I will sometimes say ontology, which is words about being. To me, ontology, being, includes theology, which is God concepts, or the potential and possibility that God is. So this is also a way that other traditions that ultimately do not rely on the concept of God, traditions such as Zen or humanism, can enter into the theological discussion, entering into it as though it were ontology, the study or words about being. Okay, those are big words and pretty brainy stuff. And before we get too far into that, I think we really need to root ourselves in practicality. Because theology is irrelevant if it's all up in the air, if it's all conceptual, if it has no effect, if it does not shape us morally and comfort us in our darkest hour. That is what theology must do. By any name, theology must be effective. It must be empowering, comforting, and fulfilling. And do keep in mind that the word theology is a noun that describes a verb, words about, study, or talking. So the idea is that theology is more of a process than a conclusion. So to practice what I just preached, before we go on, I want to ground us by revisiting what I intended to be the takeaway from last week's sermon. So do you remember the analogy of the lotus flower? And I'll remind you, our Sufi mystic Jamal Rahman encouraged us to recall that the lotus flower is a symbol of beauty and spirituality. And that we should notice that the flower has a stem that roots in the mud. The spiritual flower owes its existence to the mud. It is the mud of daily existence that feeds the root of the spiritual flower. So theology must be rooted in the mud of our daily existence, in the pain and mundane machinations that life presents us with again and again. So we will root there. We will bloom above. We have to root, but don't forget to bloom. There is not a bloom without a root, but what good is a root, especially this root, without a bloom? So last week I offered a suggestion on how we might bloom. You can consider it spiritual miracle grow. So organic this is. We talked about the example of Joshua, that is Jesus, and the power that his presence conveyed. We talked about how this presence was not imbued with supernatural powers, but with superhuman powers. Powers we may all manifest. For his presence, we are told, was one of grace, peace, mercy, and healing. So I suggested that listening to the world, because you are the world you listen to, listening to the world with a presence of peace, grace, mercy, and healing might be a first step toward a spiritual blossom. I'm going to say that again, because there is no other thing that I will ever say that will be of any greater benefit or insight. I don't know if that sets the bar high or low, but I think it's true. And I need to remind myself of it constantly. Right? So cultivating a listening presence of peace and grace and mercy and healing in dealing with the world and in dealing with each other, in dealing with one's foundation is the essence of spiritual development. And I want to make sure that we all hear that. This is both extremely difficult to maintain and incredibly easy to do. And in fact, you remember way back when I said that worship was like a lab for me, right? Well, it is time to put on our lab coats and just see how easy or difficult it may be to attain this kind of presence. So will you indulge me? Turn to a neighbor. Preferably someone that you didn't come with, but it's okay if you came with that person. Turn to a neighbor. And now just take a moment to look at your neighbor. If you don't have a neighbor, you can look at me or Irene. That's fine. All right, now we are looking at our neighbors, and now, without a word, see if you can, while looking at your neighbor, cultivate a listening presence of peace, grace, mercy, and healing. If you want, it may be appropriate time to thank your partner in the spiritual growth. So that's our ground. That is where theology must begin and end. And keep in mind that even a considered non-reactive atheism is a form of theology. So maybe you heard the subtext there, which was reactive atheism is theology. It's just bad theology. We don't want to find ourselves identifying as atheists based on somebody else's definition of God or gods. To say that you don't believe in God while thinking of a white-clad, Grizzly Adams-looking dude doesn't do credit to your imagination or the heartfelt beliefs and considered beliefs of some very traditional and some very non-traditional religious people. So by the same token, we would be equally remiss to make up something to believe in simply because it fit our demographic or some need that we may have. In other words, let's not be in the business of indulging or reacting to fairy tales. That is not good theology either. As religious people, however, I do feel it is incumbent upon each of us to do theology, if not constantly, then once every few years, to check in with yourself on this topic, to investigate our considered speculation on the quality and possibility of a divine force. And note, I make no mention of personality one way or the other. So to investigate our considered speculation and on the quality and possibility of a divine force in our lives. An abdication is not a recommended tactic. I am not a fan of the agnostic position. Either that or I love it. And here's the thing. For one, ultimately, all theology is agnostic. And that, brothers and sisters, is why they call it faith. And then there's this notion, popular presently, and with many professional and lay practitioners within our own association, perhaps some of you here, that it is sufficient to maintain reverence while replacing the word God with the word mystery. And this does have the benefit of avoiding the historical associations that complicate the use of the God word, as well as welcoming a sense of humility and wonder to the discussion. And those are good things. However, at the end of the day, we're really still talking about God without really tackling the challenge of it. It's kind of a passive-aggressive theology. And while indulging wonder and humility, we are finally saying, by using this word mystery, that whatever God is, God must not be able to be described. God exists, therefore, only where explanation is not. And this is an old mistake. Calling God mystery is the new version of an old theological wrong turn. Okay, so time was. Theology was a primary explanation of everything. It was the tool that we used to explain all natural events. But then about the Enlightenment, science started explaining everything empirically. It revealed that God did not, in fact, hold the water in the lake or make the apple fall from the tree. That gravity did that. And so then theologians, their world being completely rocked, grasping for whatever they could, said, all right, okay, we cannot compete with this empiricism, so we'll just say that God is whatever can't be explained. So God exists in the gaps between the explainable world. And this actually became the name of this style of theology, although maybe a bit derisively. It was called God of the Gaps, which is where the sermon title comes from, Mind the gap. Okay? So the trouble was that as science kept progressing, the gaps kept getting smaller. So now we've got the incredible shrinking God. So mind the gap. And it should be self-evident anyway that this kind of concept of God is a fantasy and obviously is unsustainable. So if you are one who trusts the great mystery, allow me to push you and challenge you to look further into your theology. There's more there than you are allowing yourself to behold. I do not say that this is easy, but it is fun. Not easy. And one of the great challenges of doing theology today is that over the centuries, so many wise people and some not so wise people have applied themselves to its subject, that the word at its core, the word God, has become so expansive as to be almost worthless. It's a kind of theological inflation. So that's a challenge. But on the whole, the trajectory is actually good, in my opinion, because it promotes tolerance and poetry and critical thought. But it does make it difficult to enter into the conversation, and you have to do a lot of word work, precise word work, which I think is fun. I don't know about you, but I'm up here, so I love that stuff. But that makes it impossible for an atheist to say that she is an atheist because she does not believe in Yahweh. Because what about all the other named deities? What about all the unnamed gods, or many concepts that can be rightfully, if liberally, labeled God, for lack of a more suitable word? What about consciousness? What about being? I just lost you a little bit, I understand. Consciousness and being, I mean, we were talking about God, right? Yes, but these are two unanswered and inspiring questions, provocative questions, that any theology must, in my opinion, consider. So first of all, the primal question: why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why? The other question is, what is consciousness? And as far as I can tell, no one really knows. One take on consciousness is that it is an emergent category of being. It emerges from the chemical and biological and electrical interactions of our body, but is not itself the chemical and biological and electrical interactions of our body. It comes from that, but it is not that. It is an emergent category of being. Consciousness emerges from complexity. Okay, a little further down that rabbit hole, it cannot be said that consciousness, especially self-consciousness, is a de facto result of complexity, because there are things that are more complex than us that do not have consciousness. So rather, consciousness appears to be the emergent being of a specific complexity, our complexity. But is it a unique event? Is it a unique complexity? Might it be possible for other arrangements of complexity to produce emergent consciousness? Consider the complexity of a dog, or the complexity of the galaxy, the complexity of the Earth, or the innumerable Earth-like planets in the universe, or the complexity of the universe itself, or parallel universes? Might a consciousness like our own, or vastly different than our own, but a consciousness nonetheless, emerge from these complexities? So I find these two questions pry the rusty hinges of theology open. For myself, I am at home in my theology, though it does evolve right out from underneath me from time to time. When I was young, I very much believed in a particular kind of God. It was a juvenile notion of the concept, which was dumbed down for popular digestion and handed to me, probably in spite of their better wishes, by the church of my youth. Soon, however, events overtook and overthrew that simplistic notion. I stopped believing entirely, and that was great, but also there was a mourning there. I mourned that loss, because the world lost a dimension. I lost a personality that had previously permeated everything. And so it was a lonely revelation, but it was honest. But now, many years and not a few revelations on, I have rediscovered the God concept. Now, I do not say that I believe in God, for the way in which I conceive of God does not require faith. However, this rediscovery has rejuvenated my connectivity with everything. It has brought me peace and engagement when I think on it. And so I will tell you the way in which I conceive of God in another sermon. This sermon is to encourage you to revisit your own concepts of God and mind the gap, eschew the mystery, engage your imagination and poetry. Do not abdicate language to the abusers and profiteers of religion. Do not concede your sacred path. You have the right of way. So do not be gutted of vocabulary because someone else uses terms poorly. This is your ground, and it is holy ground. This is a holy truth, or holy search for truth and meaning. It is a quest that we begin again and again. Viva la revolution. Viva la theolution. Get on with it.